On 11 August 2026, one Ukrainian strike drone took an entire Russian air defense sector's long-range vision offline, not by hitting a missile launcher, but by hitting the thing that tells the launchers where to look. The target was a P-18 Terek early warning radar, deep enough behind the line that its crew felt safe enough to be outside in the open, building a shelter over it. 7 soldiers, 1 vehicle, a half-finished roof. The drone arrived before the roof did. And the reason that single hit mattered more than a destroyed tank is the whole story here. Start with what the thing on the ground actually was, because the name means nothing to most people and everything to the people who fly against it. A P-18 is a radar. Soviet design, decades old in its bones, still in service across the Russian army in modernized form. The Terek is one of those modernized versions, new electronics, new processing, same basic idea. It sits on trucks. It unfolds a big lattice antenna, a grid of metal bars that looks more like scaffolding than a machine. And it works on VHF, long radio waves, the same rough band as old television broadcasts. That last detail is the one that matters. Long waves are clumsy, they give you a fuzzy picture. A VHF radar can tell you that something is out there at a certain bearing and a certain rough distance, but it cannot tell you precisely enough to shoot at it. What it can do is see far, well past 200 kilometers against a decent-sized target, and crucially, it can see things that shorter wavelength radars struggle with. Stealth shaping and radar-absorbing coatings are tuned against the high-frequency stuff. Against big, slow VHF waves, they work far less well. So the P-18 is not a weapon. It is a lookout. It stands on a hill or in a clearing behind the front, sweeps a huge cone of sky, and shouts down the network. Something is coming, bearing 270, roughly 90 kilometers, get ready. Behind it sit the actual shooters, the S-300 and S-400 batteries with their own fire control radars, the Pantsir and Tor systems covering the shorter ranges. Those systems have excellent eyes, but narrow ones. They are built to lock and kill, not to scan the whole horizon. Pull the lookout out of that chain and the shooters do not stop working. They just stop knowing where to point. That is the single sentence that explains why a small drone with a 3-kilogram warhead can be worth more than a tank kill. And it is why Russian crews build shelters over these radars in the first place, which is exactly what 7 men were doing on 11 August when the drone came in. This was not an isolated stunt. Ukrainian units have been working the Russian radar picture steadily through the summer of 2026, and open-source intelligence channels have logged a running series of hits on early warning and acquisition sets across the occupied territories. 2 weeks before this strike, on 27 July, another P-18 Terek was struck and destroyed in a separate operation. Different day, different crew, different sector. The pattern is the point. Somebody on the Ukrainian side made a decision months ago that the cheapest way to open Russian airspace was not to fight the missiles, but to hunt the eyes. The footage of the 11 August strike was published by a Ukrainian news outlet and credited to operators flying the RAM-2X. What it shows is short and very clear. A clearing. The lattice antenna of the P-18, unmistakable, that skeletal grid of horizontal bars stacked on a mast. Around it, the support vehicles a radar station needs, the power generator, the cabin with the operator consoles, the cabling, and around those people working. At least 7 soldiers and 1 military vehicle parked at the site. They are not fighting, they are building. A radar station in the field is a fragile thing, and everyone in the Russian air defense troops knows it. The antenna is thin metal in open air. The operator cabin is a box on a truck chassis. A single fragment through the wrong panel can take the whole set off the network for weeks, because the spare electronics for a modernized Soviet radar do not sit in a warehouse 2 hours away. So crews dig, they berm up earth walls. They build overhead cover, timber, corrugated sheet, sandbags, sometimes concrete if the engineers show up with the right gear. The goal is not to make the radar invulnerable. Nothing in that clearing was ever going to be invulnerable. The goal is to make it survive a near miss so that a drone that arrives 40 meters off target does not end the sector's early warning. The shelter under construction on 11 August was that. It was an admission, written in timber and dirt, that the Russian side already understood the threat. They knew Ukrainian drones were reaching this far. They knew radars were being hunted. They were reacting. They were just slower than the reaction required. Here is the operational problem the Russian sector commander was facing. and it is a genuinely hard one, so it is worth stating fairly rather than mocking. A radar that is hidden is a radar that cannot see. That is not a figure of speech, it is physics. To scan 200 kilometers of sky, the antenna needs clear line of sight to the horizon. Bury it in a revetment deep enough to survive a strike and you clip the bottom of its coverage, which is exactly the part of the sky where low-flying cruise missiles and drones live. Put it behind a hill and you create a shadow that an attacker can fly through. Cover it with a roof and you have to build that roof out of something radio-transparent or leave the antenna face open anyway. So the Russian answer everywhere along the line has been a compromise. Leave the antenna exposed, protect everything else. Berm the generator. Sandbag the cabin. Dig shelters for the crew. Accept that the antenna itself is a target and plan to repair or replace it. That compromise is sound engineering. It has one weakness, and the weakness is time. Building overhead cover in a forward area takes days. It takes a work party out in the open, in daylight, with a vehicle bringing material in. For the length of that construction, everything is exposed at once: the radar, the trucks, the crew, and the extra bodies brought in to do the digging. The site is at its most visible and its most crowded precisely when it is trying to become safe. Ukrainian planners work that window on purpose. Across the front, reconnaissance drones and satellite passes are used to watch for exactly this. Fresh earth, new track marks in the grass, timber stacked at the edge of a tree line, a vehicle that keeps returning to the same clearing. Construction is a signature. It says a valuable thing is here and it is not finished being protected yet. On 11 August, that signature was being written in full daylight with 7 men standing on it. Which raises the obvious question: how did anything Ukrainian get to a radar sitting that far back? A P-18 is not a frontline asset. It is deliberately placed deep, because deep is where the sky is wide and the artillery does not reach. This one was far enough back that a work party felt comfortable standing around in the open. The answer is the weapon, and the weapon is not what most people picture when they hear the word drone. Say drone in the context of this war and most viewers see a first-person view quadcopter. 4 rotors, a battery, a camera, a warhead strapped to the front. A young operator in a dugout wearing goggles. That machine is the workhorse of the Ukrainian front, and it has destroyed more Russian armor than any artillery system in the war. It also cannot do what happened on 11 August. A tactical FPV quadcopter runs on lithium cells. It has 5 to 20 kilometers of useful reach, and every one of those kilometers is fought for against wind, jamming, and battery chemistry. A radar sitting 100 kilometers back is not in that world. The RAM-2X is a different animal entirely. It is a Ukrainian-built one-way attack drone, a loitering munition, a fixed-wing aircraft in the X-wing layout, an evolution of the earlier RAM-2 family that Ukrainian units have been flying for years. Open-source reporting puts its reach at somewhere over 150 kilometers, carrying a warhead in the region of 3 kilograms. Those are approximate figures rather than an official specification sheet, and they should be read that way. But the class is unambiguous. This is a mid-range strike drone built to cross the front, cruise for an hour or more, find a specific object in the rear, and go into it. 3 kilograms sounds small. Against a tank it is small. Against a radar it is enormous. That asymmetry is the entire logic of the mission. A T-90M is a sealed steel box designed from the ground up to absorb explosions. A radar station is the opposite. A thin lattice antenna, exposed feed cables, a generator, and a cabin full of electronics that must not be jolted. A 3-kilogram warhead detonating inside that clearing throws fragments through every one of those things simultaneously. You do not need to vaporize a P-18, you need to perforate it. The wing layout matters too. An X-wing fixed-wing platform cruises efficiently on a small engine, which is what buys the range. It flies a plotted route rather than being steered meter by meter through a tree line. And it approaches from a direction and an altitude that a sector's own defenses are not necessarily arranged to catch, because those defenses are configured against the threats the sector expects: aircraft, cruise missiles, larger long-range drones on known corridors. Cost is where the exchange becomes absurd. A mid-range fixed-wing one-way attack drone of this class sits in the low tens of thousands of dollars at most, a fraction of a percent of what it costs to field, crew, and sustain a modernized radar station with its vehicles, its generators, its spares chain, and its trained operators. And unlike the radar, the drone is manufactured in quantity in workshops on a timeline measured in days. Ukraine does not have to win that trade once. It has to win it repeatedly, and it can afford to. Now hold that thought about affordability, because there is a second half to the exchange that most people miss, and it has nothing to do with the price of the radar. We will come back to it after the strike itself. Understand what the days before an operation like this look like, because the flight is the shortest part of it. A rear area radar is not found by accident. It is found because it transmits. A P-18 sweeping the sky is a powerful VHF emitter announcing its own position to anyone listening on the right band, and both sides in this war listen constantly. Electronic reconnaissance gives you a bearing, and bearings from two separated listening positions give you a rough box on a map. That box is usually a few kilometers across, enough to tell you where to look, not enough to fly into. From there, it becomes visual work. Satellite imagery over the box, looking for the shape a radar site makes. Vehicles parked in a dispersed pattern, a massed, cleared ground access tracks worn into grass that had none a month earlier. Then confirmation, a reconnaissance drone at altitude or repeated imagery passes, watching whether the vehicles are still there on the next pass and the one after. That last step is the hard one because Russian air defense units are not static. Doctrine for a survivable radar is to shoot and scoot, radiate, then move. A crew that stays in one clearing for a week has broken its own rules. A crew that is building a permanent shelter has decided not to move at all. That is the decision at the center of this story. Somewhere in the Russian chain of command, someone weighed two risks. Keep the radar mobile, relocating every few days, accepting gaps in coverage and constant wear on old equipment and exhausted crews. Or settle it into a prepared position, build cover, and get continuous, reliable coverage of the sector from a fixed point. Continuous coverage is genuinely valuable. Every relocation is hours with the sector's long-range eyes shut. Do it often enough and you have created a schedule of blind windows that an attacker will eventually find. Fixed positions are also better positions. You pick the ground for its horizon, you run proper power, you stop shaking sensitive electronics down a farm track twice a week. So the choice was defensible. It was also, on 11 August, fatal because a fixed position is a coordinate, and a coordinate is all a mid-range strike drone needs. By the morning of the strike, the site had stopped being a question and become an address. The Ukrainian side knew where it was, knew what was on it, and knew from the construction activity that it was not going anywhere in the next 24 hours. That certainty is worth more than any technical feature of the weapon. Most deep strike missions fail not because the drone was intercepted, but because the target had moved by the time it arrived. This one could not move. It had a half-built roof over it. The flight itself would have taken most of an hour. A fixed-wing one-way attack drone at this range does not scream in. It cruises. Small engine, modest speed. A plotted route that avoids the places where the crossing is dense with detection and defenses. From launch to target, it is a long, unglamorous transit over the same landscape. The whole war has been fought across tree lines, sunflower fields, the gray scar of a road, the occupied towns. The most dangerous part of that flight is not the target area. It is the front line itself, a corridor tens of kilometers deep, where both sides have stacked every electronic warfare system they own. Jammers hunting for control links and satellite navigation signals. Detection nets watching for the acoustic and radio signature of anything crossing. Gun systems and short-range missiles waiting for something to come into range. Modern strike drones cross that belt with hardened navigation and increasingly with the ability to keep flying a route with no external signal at all. Past the belt, the sky opens up. Rear areas are quieter. That is the point of rear areas. The last minutes are the ones the published footage covers. And the footage is worth describing precisely because of what it does not show. It does not show alarm. It does not show men running for cover or a vehicle accelerating away or a gun crew traversing onto a target. It shows a work site, the lattice antenna standing in the clearing, support vehicles positioned around it, timber and materials for the shelter, 7 or more soldiers on their feet spread across the site doing the physical labor of construction, the least combat-ready posture a group of soldiers can be in, hands full, gloves on, attention on the thing they are building. Nobody is looking up. That is not stupidity. A small fixed-wing drone at cruise is genuinely hard to notice. It does not have the rotor whine that gives a quadcopter away at a kilometer. It is a shape a few meters across against a bright sky, and if the approach is angled correctly, it barely appears to move at all. In the last 30 seconds, if you are not already scanning for it and have not been warned, you will not find it. And nobody warned them, for a reason with a bitter symmetry to it. The machine best equipped to spot an incoming low-flying target across that whole sector was the P-18 itself. But a radar cannot watch its own doorstep. Its coverage is a wide bowl reaching out over the horizon, not a bubble over the antenna. There is a cone directly above and a ring immediately around it that the beam simply does not sweep. The eyes were looking at 90 kilometers. The drone was inside 1,000 meters. Impact. The video ends the way all of these videos end. A hard cut to a white bloom and a channel of static because the camera is at the front of the warhead. What the explosion did is described plainly in the reporting that carried it. The radar and its equipment were knocked out of action. Read that carefully because it is more informative than a bigger claim would be. Not the radar was vaporized. Not the entire battery was destroyed. A 3-kilogram warhead detonating in that clearing does its work by fragmentation across a wide arc, and in that arc were the antenna array, the cabling, the equipment vehicles, and the men working between them. A radar does not need to be flattened to be finished. Sever the feed lines and it is deaf. Put fragments through the operator cabin and the consoles are scrap. Hole the generator and there is nothing to power any of it. Bend the lattice and the beam pattern it was calibrated for no longer exists. Of the people on that site, some did not get up. 7 or more soldiers were standing in the open around the aim point, and there was nothing between them and it. Each of them had crossed an internationally recognized border under contract to be there. What follows an event like this on the Russian side is slower and more expensive than the 4 seconds of footage suggests. The first consequence is immediate and total. The sector's long-range early warning simply stops. Whatever coverage that P-18 was providing over its arc of sky, that entire picture goes dark within a second of impact. The missile batteries it was feeding are still fully armed, fully crewed, undamaged. They are also now working blind past the reach of their own fire control radars, which is a fraction of what the VHF set could see. In practical terms, the sector's warning time collapses. Instead of tracking something inbound from 200 kilometers out and having minutes to identify it, hand it off. And decide, the batteries now find out about an intruder when it enters their own much shorter detection envelope. Against a subsonic cruise missile hugging the terrain, that can be the difference between an engagement and a detonation. The second consequence is that the hole has to be filled, and filling it costs something everywhere else. Russia does not have spare early warning radars parked behind every sector. Restoring coverage means pulling a set from an adjacent area, which thins that area. Or moving one forward from a rear zone, which means a road march. A survey, a new position, and days of the sector running degraded in the meantime. Or accepting the gap and covering it with aircraft flying radar patrol, which burns airframe hours and fuel and puts crewed aircraft in the sky over exactly the region where Ukrainian long-range systems are demonstrably active. Every one of those options is worse than the situation before 11 August. That is what a successful strike on a sensor looks like. Not a crater, but a menu of bad choices. The third consequence is the one that compounds. A radar site that has been hit once is a site whose location is confirmed. Any replacement set has to go somewhere else, which means new survey, new power, new communications trenching, and a new shelter. The same shelter project that was in progress on 11 August started again from bare ground somewhere else. Meanwhile, the crews who do this work are not interchangeable. Air defense radar operators are trained specialists, and a work party standing in the open next to their equipment is exactly the wrong place for specialists to be. Which brings back the point left open earlier, the second half of the exchange rate. The obvious arithmetic is the one everyone quotes. A drone worth a small fraction of a radar's cost destroys the radar. True and stark. But the deeper cost is not the equipment. It is what the threat does to Russian behavior across every sector that has not been hit yet. Once early warning radars are being reached at this depth, every Russian air defense commander along the front has to assume his own site is next. So he relocates more often, which means more hours per week with his sector's eyes closed. He disperses his vehicles further, which stretches cabling and slows setup. He builds shelters, which requires work parties in the open, and the work party is now a known vulnerability. He requests decoy sets, engineer support, and covering short-range systems that have to come out of somewhere else. None of that appears in any loss tally. All of it degrades the network's actual performance. A radar that spends more time on the road, radiating less, positioned for survivability rather than for the best horizon, is a radar that sees less even on the days nobody attacks it. That is the real return on a single strike drone. Not one destroyed antenna, but a permanent tax levied on every other antenna in the theater. There is also a straightforward operational return, and it is the one Ukrainian planners are actually buying. Every kilometer of degraded Russian radar coverage is a kilometer of airspace that becomes usable for something else. Ukrainian long-range strike drones going after refineries and airfields deep inside Russia have to cross that coverage. Cruise missiles fired at rear area headquarters and ammunition depots have to cross it. Reconnaissance assets that map the next set of targets have to cross it. Each early warning set removed widens the corridor those missions fly through. And each widened corridor makes the next strike a little cheaper and a little more likely to arrive. That is why the hunt for radars runs continuously rather than opportunistically. It is not revenge and it is not a highlight reel. It is the preparation phase for everything that comes after clear the eyes, then use the sky. There is a version of this story where the shelter gets finished. The timber goes up, the earth gets pushed into a berm, the sandbags are stacked, the work party goes back to its base, and the site becomes a hardened position that a 3-kilogram warhead might have survived, at least in part. That version was maybe 2 or 3 days away. It did not happen, and the reason it did not happen is worth stating plainly, because it is the single most useful lesson in this whole engagement. The act of making something safe is itself the moment of maximum exposure. You cannot dig a shelter quietly. You cannot build a roof without standing under an open sky. Every hour of that work is an hour of advertisement, visible from above, saying that something valuable is here and it is not protected yet. Ukrainian units have learned to read that advertisement across the entire front, at ammunition dumps, at command posts, at fuel points, and now at radar sites. Fresh earth is a target indicator. A parked truck that returns to the same clearing 3 days running is a target indicator. A work party is a target indicator. The Russian sector commander made a reasonable decision to fix his radar in place and harden it. He was working from an assumption that had been true for most of this war and stopped being true sometime in the last year, that 150 kilometers of distance is protection. It is not, and it has not been for a while. The reach of cheap one-way attack aircraft has moved the line of what counts as rear area steadily backward, month after month, until the map has very little genuine rear left on it. On 11 August 2026, that shift arrived at one specific clearing, at the exact wrong moment for the men standing in it. A radar built to see 200 kilometers did not see the thing that ended it, because the thing that ended it was already inside the ring its beam could not sweep. 7 soldiers who had crossed a border to run that machine were the last thing between it and the sky, and they were holding lumber. The shelter was never finished. It didn't need to be. The sector had already gone blind.